We are here today to talk about an issue of huge consequence to the American people, an issue that, in my view, does not get the kind of attention that it deserves. And that is the fact that the American people today are paying by far the highest prices in the world for the prescription drugs that they need. When we talk about health care, we are talking about the need of the American people to be able to afford the medicine their doctors prescribe. A life-saving drug does nobody any good if the patient cannot afford that product, and that is happening far too often in our country. Last year, this is really quite unbelievable. Last year, nearly 1 out of every 5 Americans between the ages of 19 and 64, that's 35 million people, did not get their prescriptions filled because they did not have enough money. They couldn't afford it. And I remember talking to doctors in working class areas in Vermont, and they say, we're writing out prescriptions, and about a quarter of the people they write it for can't fill the prescriptions. What sense is that? In other words, people all over this country walk into a doctor's office because they are sick. They pay for their visit. The doctor spends time diagnosing their problems, and then the doctor writes out a prescription to treat the illness, but 20% of our people are unable to afford the medicine they need that the doctor has just prescribed. And what happens if somebody is sick and doesn't get the medicine they need? Well, obviously, they will get sicker, and in some cases, they will die. This is an unacceptable situation that we have to address. I should tell you that all over this country, people have contacted my office. We have close to 1,000 people who have written to us about the impact of the high cost of prescription drugs on their lives. I'll just read one, and there are many. This is from a person in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, who writes, Advair, the asthma medicine I need, with my insurance was a couple of $100. And when I didn't have insurance, it was over $300. I am a part-time teacher that didn't get insurance through work and doesn't get paid during the summer. Before I could afford to start up insurance again, I had a major asthma attack, and I honestly thought I was going to die on the sidewalk. So that's what's happening to people all over this country who simply cannot afford the medicine they desperately need. The American people should not have to go without the medication they need because Congress does not have the courage to stand up to one of the most powerful lobbying operations here on Capitol Hill, and that is the pharmaceutical industry. The time has come to say very loudly and clearly that enough is enough. The greed of the pharmaceutical industry is killing Americans and making many of them much sicker than they otherwise would have been. It has got to stop. It is unacceptable that while millions of Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs they need, the top 3 pharmaceutical companies made a combined $45 billion in profits last year and spent more on sales and marketing than they did on research and development. It is unacceptable that total spending on medicine in the United States of America has gone up by more than 90% since 2002. It is unacceptable that the monthly cost of cancer drugs has more than doubled over the last 10 years to $9,900 a month. And I think many of you have seen a letter written by oncologists talking about how their patients are unable to purchase the drugs, the cancer drugs that they are prescribing. Instead of listening to the demands of the pharmaceutical industry and their 1,400 lobbyists, an industry which spent over $250 million last year on campaign contributions and lobbying expenses. It is about time for Congress to start listening to the vast majority of the American people who know there's something wrong when we pay by far the highest drug prices in the world. It is time for the United States to join the rest of the industrialized world by implementing prescription drug policies that work for everybody, not just the CEOs of the pharmaceutical industry. And let me just very briefly summarize some of the components of the bill that Congressman Cummings and I will be introducing today. First, the bill requires Medicare to use its bargaining power to negotiate with the prescription drug companies for better prices. This is not a radical idea. It's something that the VA, other government agencies do. When you purchase a lot of product, you use the power, the leverage of that bulk purchasing to force down prices. 2, this bill would allow individuals, pharmacists, and wholesalers to import prescription drugs from licensed Canadian pharmacies where drug prices are 40% lower per person than they are in the United States of America. Back in 1999, I was the first member of Congress to take Americans over the Canadian border. I live 100 miles away from Canada. We border Canada in Vermont. And I will never forget, as long as I live, women who were struggling with breast cancer purchasing a product they needed, a medicine they needed, for 1/10 of the price that they were paying in the United States of America. And I know I got a lot of colleagues out there who believe in free trade. They love free trade. Yet somehow or another, despite their great love for free trade, we have distributors who cannot import medicine from Canada. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Number 3, this bill would hold the pharmaceutical industry accountable when they defraud the American people. Today, nearly every major pharmaceutical company has been convicted of either civil or criminal fraud. 4, this bill would end pay for delay, a practice in which brand name prescription drug companies pay other companies not to manufacture cheaper generic drugs. I'm delighted that the legislation that Congressman Cummings and I are introducing is endorsed by the Alliance for Retiring Americans, Social Security Works, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, Families USA, and many other groups. So we are on to an issue that I believe the American people want resolved, and I'm very proud to be working with Congressman Cummings. When we talk about prescription drugs, it's important to understand that in our country, we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. That's simply the reality. And that causes enormous problems because millions of our people go to the doctor writes a prescription, and then the person can't afford to fill that prescription. So that's pretty crazy because doctors are doing the diagnosis, telling the patients what they need. Patients can't afford to pay for the drugs because they are the highest prices in the world in this country. So, Mr. President, this is an issue that we have got to deal with. Now, there are a number of reasons why prices in this country are higher than in Canada, Europe, Scandinavia, and certainly one of them is that we are the only major country on earth that doesn't have a national health care program so that the government can negotiate prices with the drug companies. So what happens in this country is the drug companies simply charge us what the market will bear, any price they can come up with by which they can make money. And the end result is that we pay, in 2009, prices in this country were 85% higher than Canada, 150% higher than France, Italy, Sweden, and Switzerland, and so forth and so on. But the reason the drug prices are high in this country is not just that we don't have a national health care program. It's because of the enormous amount of fraud that takes place within the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, every single year, the major drug companies are ripping off the American people to the tune of billions of dollars a year because of fraudulent practices. Virtually every major pharmaceutical company in this country has either been convicted of fraud, i.e. ripping off federal government, state government, or individuals, or else has reached a settlement. And we have got to get a handle on this crisis. Now, I want to read. I'm going to bore some people because it's a long list. Sadly, it is a long list. But it's a list that has to get out, and it is an issue that we have got to deal with. So here we go. Abbott Labs is one of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world. It had $38.8 billion in revenues and $4.7 billion in profits in 2011. Just last month, Abbott reached an agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice to pay $1.6 billion for illegally marketing the anti-seizure drugs Depakote. Pfizer is the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, $67.9 billion in revenues and $10 billion in profits in 2011. Pfizer. In 2012, this year, Pfizer allegedly avoided paying hundreds of millions in rebates due to state Medicaid programs for Prontonix. Johnson & Johnson is the second largest pharmaceutical company in the world, which had $65 billion in revenues and almost $10 billion in profits in 2011. In 2012, this year, Johnson & Johnson illegally marketed Risperdal, an antipsychotic medication, to nursing home patients and paid over $2 billion in fines. GlaxoSmithKline is, again, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, made profits of almost $44 billion in 2011. GlaxoSmithKline in 2011 announced that it had reached, quote, an agreement in principle, end quote, with the U.S. government to pay $3 billion, $3 billion, to conclude the company's most significant ongoing federal government investigations. Mr. President, in 2010, the pharmaceutical industry achieved a dubious distinction. It surpassed the notoriously corrupt defense contracting industry in defrauding the government. The pharmaceutical industry accounted for nearly half, $1.8 billion of a total of $4.1 billion of the penalties collected in 2011 by the Department of Health and Human Services Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Control Program. In 2012, and this is really quite amazing, the pharmaceutical industry is expected to pay out up to 4 times the amount of last year's penalty, between $8 to $9 billion. $8 to $9 billion in penalties due to pending fraud settlements with the Department of Justice. Virtually every major drug company has either been found guilty of or settled charges of significant fraud over the last 10 years. The question arises, and this really is an important question, is fraud within the pharmaceutical industry the exception? Does it just happen here or there, or is it simply put their business model? Is fraud the business model of the pharmaceutical industry, who think that in most cases they can get away with the fraud, make huge profits, and in some cases when they get caught, they will in fact pay a penalty, but the penalty will in no way match the kinds of huge profits they're making from their fraudulent activity. It is clear that the punishments that we now have on the books have not done enough to address this problem, because apparently the drug companies are not too intimidated by the laws on the books. They think it makes business sense for them to continue going forward on their fraudulent activities. The amendment that I am offering would send a strong and clear message to the drug industry. Illegal behavior will not be rewarded with continued government-granted monopolies. Our people are paying the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. One of the reasons is widespread fraudulent activity on the part of virtually every major drug company in our country. It is no longer acceptable to turn a blind eye to that crisis.